Good evening. I'm sorry that I couldn't be there with you all in person this evening, but I did want to take this moment to give a big shout out to my dear sister, Wendy Oxenhorn. You have dedicated yourself to being a tireless advocate for jazz and blues musicians and become a vital part of our music family. Your leadership of the Jazz Foundation has left an indelible and invaluable mark on our community. My beloved Wendy, thank you for being who you are, baby, and for all that you do. And please know that I'm sending you all of my love and big, big hugs. My beloved funky harmonica playing barefoot Baroness Wendy Oxenhorn. I love you.
Please welcome National Endowment for the Arts Jazz Master and founding director and the heart and soul of the Jazz Foundation of America, Wendy Oxenhorn.
Tonight, we are honoring Wendy Oxenhorn. We can only give the abbreviated version of what has been a lifetime spent giving her love to the world.
From the time I was 4, I fell in love with dance. And then I had a really terrible injury. The doctor, he said, you'll be crippled by the time you're 30 if you continue. I remember I called up a suicide hotline because telling me I couldn't dance, you've just ruined my life, and I didn't think I could go on. When I called up the suicide hotline, this woman answered, and she started to tell me her problems, probably because I asked how things were going for her. 3 days later, I was working at the suicide hotline, helping other people who were in trouble, and it saved my life. And that's really how I got into this business of helping people.
In 1989, Wendy co-founded Street News, the first street newspaper that transformed the lives of New York City's homeless men and women, offering them instant employment and a way to pay for their own food and shelter. Her efforts for the homeless landed her on talk shows and front pages of newspapers around the world.
Wendy, I think it's a great idea. You're putting a lot of people back to work, and that's terrific. Thanks.
Street News inspired 130 homeless sold street papers in 35 countries, many of which are still employing the world's homeless after 30 years. Wendy's daughter Sky inspired her next effort when she came home from school at the age of 12, saying some girls in her class admitted to feeling suicidal. Wendy gathered the girls, and they shared their stories of sexual abuse from living with alcoholic families. Wendy started weekly meetings that gave them a safe place to see that they weren't alone and built a support system that partnered them safely into high school. After a heartbreak in 1999, Wendy taught herself the harmonica to get over the blues and wound up gigging in train stations with a legendary blues man from Mississippi. Little did she know that that heartbreak and that harmonica would cause her to save the lives of musicians all over the world, one musician at a time. In 2000, through a twist of fate, Wendy, a single parent with 2 young children, saw an ad for an organization that was helping elderly jazz musicians. During the interview, when they discovered she was a blues man, they hired her on the spot as their sole employee. They only had $7,000 in their operating accounts. The organization desperately needed money, so Wendy proposed an idea, a gala called A Great Night in Harlem at the Apollo Theater. But there was no money to rent the theater, so Jarrett Lillian, then an executive at E-Trade and now longtime JFA president, offered to put up the rent. With a 22-year-old assistant named Lauren Roberts, they produced their very first A Great Night in Harlem. The concert featured more than 100 jazz legends, and the money raised paid the rents for hundreds of musicians whose tours were canceled because of 9/11. And the rest is history.
Wendy's commitment and care and her tireless passion and her blood and her sweat and her tears have defined the Jazz Foundation's heart and soul.
Wendy is the most passionate and dedicated advocate for jazz and blues musicians on the face of this planet.
Wendy and Lauren expanded the Jazz Foundation beyond jazz to now help blues, soul, R&B, and roots musicians, and soon the organization was assisting 500 cases a year. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina shocked the world. Wendy flew to New Orleans to locate musicians who had lost everything. They would need instruments, housing, and work. She was able to secure a $250,000 commitment to provide horns, keyboards, and drum kits for icons like Trombone Shorty, DeVell Crawford, the Treme Brass Band, Henry Butler, and many more. Wendy hired more staff, and they worked day and night getting musician families out of shelters and into new homes. She created instant employment for displaced musicians with a Jazz and Blues in the Schools program. Wendy invited the Met Opera patron Dr. Agnes Veris to an event one night, and St. Agnes committed to fund it, providing employment to hundreds of musicians who could now support their families and pay their own rent. Agnes gave millions of dollars for years to follow, keeping musicians working for a decade until her sad passing. JFA changed the lives of over 1,000 NOLA musician families and brought the music and the musicians back to New Orleans. For 2 decades, Wendy Oxenhorn has raised money, built a board, a strong staff, and a community of spectacular human beings. She tirelessly visited musicians in their homes and even held their hands when it was time for them to leave the planet. Tonight, we are celebrating Wendy as the visionary who transformed the JFA. But as she says, it's because there is you that we have saved the lives and homes of thousands of musicians whose music has gotten us through our own hard times. Musicians who have played with everyone from Frank Sinatra to John Lennon, David Bowie to Jimi Hendrix, Billie Holiday to the Rolling Stones, even the legends themselves. Because of you, we were there for Roberta Flack, Clark Terry, Sinead O'Connor, Al Jarreau, Wayne Shorter, Dr. John, Abby Lincoln, just to name a few. At JFA, that's how we thank them for all they gave us.
Wendy, you are an angel. I can't thank you enough. It's a blessing that I got to know you. It's a blessing that you're doing what you're doing out here for everybody. We love you. I love you. And hey, don't go too far away, baby.
Wendy Oxenhorn has created a utopian template that runs on the power of love and takes on 8,000 emergency cases a year. Her heart, her soul, and her philosophy of giving have inspired over $70 million in funding during her time at JFA. In 2020, she stepped off the bandstand, leaving JFA in the strong hands of Joe Petrocelli and the JFA team, who have since helped thousands of musicians through the pandemic and continue to solve life and death emergencies every day. And as for Wendy, this year she went to Ukraine in the midst of the war, delivering food to children in orphanages and medical supplies to hospitals and civilian soldiers. While there, she located over 100 Ukrainian jazz musicians and connected them to JFA, which now funds gigs and provides food and life-saving supplies to their families, helping to keep the music alive during the war.
I am a Buddhist, and in my religion, we call someone like Wendy a bodhisattva, and that is a person who dedicates their life to serving and helping others, and that's who Wendy is. Her happiness comes from helping people. I mean, in my opinion, she should get a Congressional Medal of Honor.
Wendy is a unique character. She literally comes out of like a magical mystery tour. She's part fairy. She's part healer. She's big part friend. She's been the soul and spirit of the Jazz Foundation. Love you, Wendy.